Welcome to Miss Mason Explains the Experimental Method. All right, so this is the next research method we are going to discuss in psychology. All right, so an experiment is simply where a researcher manipulates an independent variable to measure the impact on the dependent variable. All right, in psychology, we're going to be looking at the effect of an experimental change, the independent variable, on a behavior or a mental process, our dependent variable. One of the most famous social experiments is the Stanford Prison Experiment, which we will discuss in great detail in our last unit, the social psychology unit. All right. So you have three different types of variables that we're going to be talking about in psychology. The first type is the independent variable. This is the variable that we are trying to manipulate that is going to cause a change in our dependent variable. That's the next one. Our dependent variable is the variable that we expect a change due to the independent variable. So let's go back to our ADHD and sugar hypothesis that we've been talking about. Sugar is going to cause the ADHD. The ADHD is going to have the sugar is going to have an effect on ADHD. Does that make sense? Cause and effect. Sugar is going to cause the effect of ADHD. Boom. All right. So sugar is our independent variable. ADHD is our dependent variable. However, I have to warn you that there are other variables that might have an effect on our dependent variable. These are known as confounding variables. Here's an example. All right. Did ice cream sales cause a rise in violence, or was it vice versa? Now, if you're looking at your data, you're going to see that there is a rise in violence on days that ice cream sales were increased. Now, why is this? Well, it could be because of the air temperature. Okay. Um, when people are really hot, do they get violent? What? So that could be a confounding variable. Now, when you are trying to create your experiment, when you're designing your experiment, I have to tell you that one of the principles in psychology is that you try not to let your confounding variables vary. Okay, you want to keep them very precise. And how do we do this? We do this through random assignment. Okay, so one of the ways that we can rule out confounding variables is by using random assignment. Now, this is an actual study that was discussed in your textbook, that women were randomly selected to be in a group in which breastfeeding was promoted. This research was actually done in Belarus. So I have to tell you, the result of the study may have been confounded by the location. So here we go, random assignment. So these women were randomly assigned into the experimental group and the control group. All right. In the experimental group, they were breastfeeding was promoted, and in the control group, breastfeeding was not promoted. And what they were trying to find out is, does breastfeeding actually affect the intelligence score of the infant? All right. Now, the actual result was that 43% of the women in the breastfeeding promotion group chose breastfeeding, but only 6% in the control group chose breastfeeding. Now, why is that? Why do you think only 43% chose breastfeeding, where only 6% in the control group chose breastfeeding? This might have been because in Belarus, this was part of the world that you're more influenced to purchase formula instead of breastfeeding. The actual results on the dependent variable was that kids in the experimental group actually scored 6 percentage points higher on average than those children that were in the control group. But again, only 43% of the breastfeeding experimental group actually chose breastfeeding. So this is interesting to see, how the results are affected by random assignment. So again, random assignment, All right, this is so that we can control those confounding variables such as parental intelligence, your environment, your early childhood education. All right, so we're trying to eliminate those confounding variables. All right, your control group. So we talked about the experimental group. We're going to talk about the control group. So the experimental group are the people that are going to experience the manipulation of the independent variable. But how are we going to know that the change wouldn't have happened anyways? Well, we use a control group, okay? This control group is going to be a group that is the same in every way of the experimental group except for the independent variable. So for our experiment of ADHD and sugar, two groups of children have ADHD, but only one group is going to stop eating refined sugar, okay? All right. But how do we make sure that the control group is identical in every way to our experimental group? Like the confounding variables, random assignment. I'm telling you, random assignment is so important in experiments, okay? And random assignment is randomly selecting your participants to either be assigned into your control group or your experimental group, okay? All right, boom. Now, there is also something called the placebo effect, all right? So how do we make sure that the experimental group is not experiencing the effect because they expect to experience it? Such as, here's the example. An experimental group gets a new drug while the control group gets nothing, yet both groups improve. Why is this? Exactly. Because the experimental group says, oh, yeah, that medicine, it really helped. It's called a placebo effect, okay, where they feel like the effect actually happened when in reality it didn't. So the placebo effect is when the experimental effects that are caused by expectations about the intervention, about the independent variable, all right? So how can we work with this placebo effect? How can we eliminate it? Well, first off, the control group is going to be given the placebo, which is an inactive substance or a fake treatment in place of the experimental treatment. Okay. Now I have to also note that the placebo effect can happen for other non-psychotopic psycho treatments in medications, psychotherapy, and interventions. Okay, so this can happen pretty much in any experiment. Okay, all right. So again, how can we control this? All right. Well, you can do it by making sure that your control group is blind about whether they are in the experimental group or the control group. So you want to make sure that no one knows, are you part of the experimental group or are you part of the control group? So that will really help you eliminate the placebo effect. Many studies actually use the double-blind procedure, which will decrease the amount of placebo effect. All right, so these double blinds, I have to explain it because it's really confusing. So double blind is where the participants and the researcher, okay, both do not know which participants are in the experimental group or the control group. Okay, now the best example I can give you is, how many of you watch Grey's Anatomy? Okay, so I love Grey's Anatomy. It's one of my favorites. I've loved it since it started. So anyways, Grey's Anatomy. So we have Grey and we have McSteamy, which I don't remember his name. Anyways, McSteamy. And they were doing an experiment on Alzheimer's patients. Now, one of the participants, they really wanted to make sure that that participant received the Alzheimer's experimental drug, all right? But you cannot know this because this will create the placebo effect, okay? So you cannot know, is this individual receiving the experimental drug or the placebo? So what happened was they would get a number, okay? So the number would have the medication inside of the, like a little bag. Now this was created, the little bags were created by a third party, okay? Whoever created the medication, whoever developed the medication, all right? So they would put either sugar pills or whatever inactive substance in one packet, and they would put just a number. And then they would put the actual medication in another bag and put the number. So then when you create your control group and your experimental group, all you're going to know is that number is identified to that person. And then when you're doing the data collection, the data analysis at the very end is when you're going to find out, was this participant, was that number part of the experimental group or the control group? And that's when you're going to find out actually who are they part of which group, so that you as the researcher, the experimenter, does not influence the placebo effect. So you don't know if they're getting the placebo, they don't know you're getting the placebo. Does that make sense? Double blind. All right. Okay. Here's a summary of the research methods that we have talked about. The first one was descriptive. All right. Nothing's being manipulated. There's no control variable. There's no independent variable, nothing like that. It's just where you're going to observe and record behavior. We have correlational. All right. This is where you're just going to see, does one variable, is there a relationship with another variable? Not cause and effect. I repeat, correlational does not have cause and effect. If you see cause and effect, boom, experimental. We're going to explore the cause and effect. The manipulation of one factor on and see, does that affect another factor? So we're going to manipulate the independent variable. All right. Sometimes I have to tell you, it is not possible to experiment on people for ethical reasons. So just got to be really careful about which research method you choose. All right. And we're going to talk about ethics and psychology later this unit. All right. So you are going to do an apply and practice to really practice your experimental design. Okay. Because we do struggle with independent variables, the experimental group, the control group, the dependent variable, observational definitions, and possible confounding variables. Now I have to tell you, one of the FRQs on the AP exam has traditionally been in an experimental design question. We were really thrown off last year. They did not have a research methods question, so we're really thrown off. But I'm expecting next year them to actually pick back up on that. So here's an example of the apply and practice, what I want you to do. Does having a study partner increase your test scores? The independent variable is the study partner. The experimental group is the group with the study partner. My control group is the group without the study partner. Okay. The dependent variable is increased test scores. So test scores. My observational definition is the study partner, a fellow classmate who meets with at least 2 times a week to study your class notes. Also, I wanted to define, what does an increase in test scores mean? An increase of at least 10% on your previous test score. Okay. All right. So again, independent variable. Does having a study partner, okay, that's what's going to be changing, increase, does that have an effect on the test scores? Some confounding variables is amount of study time, the test difficulty, the individual's motivation and abilities. Do they really have the intelligence to do well on this test? Are they motivated to do well on this test? That kind of a thing. So you see what I am looking for in the apply and practice. All right, now you can complete your apply and practice. This is the end of Miss Mason Explains the Experimental Method.